All rise for the Honorable Judge Eleanor Marsh. Every person in that federal courtroom stood, every single one, except the billionaire in the charcoal suit. Richard Calloway stayed seated, flipping through his legal pad. Like the woman walking to that bench was an interruption. Like the 380 families he destroyed were background noise. His lawyer leaned in, whispering, urgent. Calloway waved him off. The room went still. Reporter stopped writing. A widow in the third row forgot how to breathe. And Judge Marsh? She paused. 1 second. Just one. Her face gave away nothing. And she sat down and said in 4 quiet words, "You may be seated." That was it. No warning, no anger. But somewhere behind those eyes, a clock had just started ticking. He thought his money made him untouchable. She was about to teach him what untouchable actually means. The courthouse steps were cold that morning. Not the kind of cold comes from weather. The kind that comes from waiting too long for something you're not sure will ever arrive. Margaret Flora Flores, everyone called her Maggie, had been awake since 4. She'd lain in the dark for an hour, watching the ceiling, listening to the refrigerator hum, and the distant sound of a garbage truck making its rounds through streets that didn't know what day this was. She gave up at 5, showered, stood in front of her closet for a long time. The buzz blouse, the good one. She'd worn it the day Claire graduated high school 3 years ago. She'd ironed it twice this morning because the first time didn't feel careful enough. She was 58 years old. She had raised a daughter by herself. 31 years as an office administrator for a school district in Sacramento. She had painted the front door of her house yellow because Claire, at age 7, had said yellow was the happiest color. She had planted a rose by the mailbox the spring Claire started kindergarten. She had never missed a mortgage payment in 22 years, not once, until she did. She drove downtown in the silence of a city still deciding whether to be awake. Found the coffee cart on the corner, ordered a medium black, paid with exact change, stood on the courthouse steps and drank it while the fog came off the bay in slow gray sheets. In her purse, tucked beneath her wallet and her reading glasses and a small packet of tissues she'd already gone through twice this week, was a white envelope. Inside the envelope was a photograph. The house, her house, the yellow door, the rose bush. She didn't take it out. She already knew every detail by heart. She finished her coffee, dropped the cup in the bin, straightened her blouse, and walked up the steps. Gene Huckley was already inside, 67 years old, former lieutenant with the San Francisco Fire Department, 35 years of service. The kind of man who walked into burning buildings for a living and never once thought about calling in sick. He was wearing the navy blue jacket from his retirement ceremony 12 years ago, a little snug across the shoulders now. He'd thought about wearing something else, then decided against it. He'd worn this jacket the day they gave him his commendation. He'd wear it today, too. He found Maggie's spot before she did. Was already sitting when she came through the security line. She settled beside him on the bench in the third row. Neither of them said good morning. They didn't need to. They had met 3 months ago in a waiting room at the Victim Services office downtown, sat next to each other for 40 minutes before either one spoke. Then Gene had looked over and said very quietly, "You too?" Maggie had said, "Yeah, me too." That was enough. They'd been showing up together ever since. The courtroom around them was filling fast. Reporters took the back rows. People shuffled into the remaining benches shoulder to shoulder, voices low and taut. Outside, news vans had been parked since 6 in the morning. A woman telling on the sidewalk held a handmade sign. "Justice for Calloway's victims," in red marker, the ink run slightly from the morning fog. Maggie could see it through the window. She looked at it, then looked away. She didn't need a sign. She needed her hands to stop shaking before this started. She needed more than anything for today to mean something. For all of it to mean something. Because if it didn't, she stopped that thought. Fold it, put it away. Not yet. The doors at the far end of the courtroom swung open at 8:47 in the morning. And Richard Calloway walked in like he owned the building, which technically he once has had. He'd purchased the historic building 2 blocks north of this courthouse as a real estate investment in 2014. Sold it for 3 times the price 4 years later. Back when the headlines about him were different. Back when Forbes called him a self-made visionary. Back when profile photos showed him laughing on a yacht somewhere off the Malibu coast. He was 58 years old, broad shoulders, silver hair swept back under the fluorescent light. A charcoal gray suit that probably cost more than Maggie's last 3 months of rent combined. He was still on his phone when he came through the door. Not wrapping up, not finishing a thought, walking, talking. Like the entire room, the reporters, the bailiffs, the 24 victims who had traveled from 4 different states to be here, was background noise he hadn't bothered to adjust to yet. His voice carried, low and smooth. Tell them to wait. I'll be done with this in a few hours. A few hours. Like today was a meeting on the way to something better. Like today was weather. He moved to the defendant's table with the ease of a man navigating his own living room. Finally hung up, slid the phone into his breast pocket, looked around the room with flat, pale eyes, found the reporters in the back rows, offered them a small, practiced smile. The smile of a man who believes the cameras are there to admire him. He did not look at Maggie. He did not look at Jean. He sat down and opened a legal pad and began flipping through it like a man reviewing his grocery list. Jean made a sound beside Maggie. Not a word. Not quite a breath. She put her hand briefly on his arm, not to comfort him, to remind herself to stay in her seat. Richard Calloway had not always been like this. That was the part the headlines never spent much time on, the part that made everything more complicated than people wanted it to be. He had grown up in Fresno. Father was an electrician. Mother worked checkout at a grocery store. They weren't poor. They weren't rich. They counted things, counted carefully. Richard had been the kind of smart that gets noticed early. Math, competitions, scholarship offers, the first in his family to attend a good university. And he had worked, genuinely worked, 80-hour weeks in his 20s, a futon in a studio apartment, learning everything he could about markets and money and the way capital moved. He'd believed in something back then, in proving himself, in building something real, in the idea that intelligence combined with effort equaled something worth having. But somewhere in the middle six, somewhere between the first million and the 10th, something had tilted, not broken, just shifted off center. The wind started feeling like not enough. The legitimate deal started feeling too slow, and there were men in better suits around nicer dinner tables who looked at him and said, Richard, you're leaving money on the table. The smart money doesn't wait for the market. The smart money creates the narrative. He told himself it was strategy. He told himself no one would get hurt. The first time he falsified a report, his hands trembled slightly. He noticed that he poured himself a drink. By the time the glass was empty, he had decided the trembling was just nerves, not conscience. By the third time, his hands were completely still. There was a man standing against the back wall of the courtroom, not sitting, standing, arms crossed, wearing a gray sport coat that had been bought some years ago and worn many times since. He was around 60, heavier faced than Richard, broader through the shoulders, the same pale eyes, but with something different living in them. Something that had been arguing with itself for a long time without resolution. His name was Thomas Calloway, Richard's older brother. Nobody paid attention to him. He wasn't on any witness list. He wasn't a scheduled participant. He was just a man standing in the back of a crowded room, watching his younger brother settle into the defendant's chair with the casual comfort of someone who had never once been told no, and genuinely believed, that today would not be the first time. Thomas watched him. His face didn't move, but something behind his eyes was doing difficult arithmetic. He had driven 4 hours to get here this morning, hadn't told anyone he was coming, didn't know yet what he was going to do. He just needed to cease. With his own eyes, he needed to see it. All rise for the Honorable Judge Eleanor Marsh. The bailiff's voice cut through the room like current through wire. Every single person in that courtroom got to their feet. The reporters in the back, the victims along the sides, the clerks, the junior attorneys, the elderly woman in the second rows who had some difficulty standing and did it anyway, quietly, without asking for help. Every single person, except Richard Calloway. He stayed seated, flipping through his legal pad, reading glasses on. His attorney, Warren Lyles, silver tie, mid-50s, the practiced posture of someone who had won too many cases to carry visible nerves, leaned in close and said something urgent into Richard's ear. Richard lifted one hand, just slightly, just enough, and waved him off. The room noticed. The room absolutely noticed. Maggie's breath caught. Jean went completely still beside her. The reporters in the back rows started writing without looking at their notebooks. A ripple of disbelief moved through the gallery, quiet but unmistakable, the way a wheel wind moves through tall grass. And then Judge Eleanor Marsh entered. She was 61 years old. She moved with the kind of authority that doesn't need to announce itself. No rushing, no performance. She walked to the bench the way someone walks into a room they'd have belonged to for a very long time and know they will belong to long after today. Black judicial robe, natural hair, silver at the temples, worn exactly the way she wanted it. 11 years on the federal bench. Before that, 9 years as an assistant U.S. attorney. Before that, a clerkship under a federal judge who told her on her first day, "This job is not about winning, it is about being right." She had thought about such since almost every day since. She reached the bench. She looked out at the courtroom. She saw Richard Calloway sitting down. She paused, One breath's worth. The kind of pause you would miss if you blinked. Her expression did not change. Her posture did not change. She stood there for one deliberate second. Then she sat. "You may be seated," she said. Her voice was even, measured, warm in the way that very controlled things are warm, like a room held at an exact temperature, comfortable but not soft. She did not address the slight, not directly, not yet, but the rooms had shifted. Everyone felt it. That particular feeling of watching someone absorb an insult without reacting to it, and understanding, without anyone saying a word, that the absorbing is itself the response, that the patience is not weakness, that the patience is the thing to be afraid of. Richard Calloway finally looked up from his legal pad. He looked at Judge Eleanor Marsh. She was already looking at something else, a document in front of her. She picked up her pen. He went back to his legal pad. And Maggie Flores, sitting in the third row with her hands folded in her lap, thought, she saw it. She knows exactly what he did, and she is not going to let him see that she knows. Not yet. Eleanor Marsh had grown up in Baltimore, not the Harborview Baltimore, not the renovated row house Baltimore. The Baltimore where windows had drafts in winter, and the radiator banged all night, and you learned to sleep through it because there was no other option. Her father's name was James. He worked at a printing plant for 26 years. He read the newspaper every morning, cover to cover, and talked to Eleanor about what he'd read over breakfast. He believed in knowing things, in understanding the world rather than just moving through it. Eleanor was 14 when the company that owned the plant was absorbed by a larger financial holding group out of New York. It happened the way those things always happen, fast and clean on paper, devastating in the real world. Within 8 months, the plant restructured. Within a year, it closed. 212 men lost their jobs, including James Marsh. He never found work that paid as well again. Not because he stopped trying, he tried for years. But there is a specific kind of damage that happens to a man in his late 40s who loses the work he has spent his whole adult life doing. A quiet damage. The kind you don't discuss at dinner. The kind that shows up in small ways, in how he holds the newspaper, and how he answers the phone, and how he goes to bed earlier and earlier as the seasons turn. Eleanor had watched all of it. She was a serious girl, observant. The kind of child who sits in the corner at gatherings and studies the room instead of joining it. She watched what happened to her father, and she thought, why? Not just why did this happen, but why did the people who made it happen face nothing? Why did they take their bosoas and move on to the next opportunity, while men like James Marsh spent the rest of their years trying to climb back to a height they had already earned? She wanted to understand the machinery, and then she wanted to get inside it. University of Maryland on a full scholarship. Law school, the U.S. Attorney's Office, the federal bench. 30 years of being the only black woman in the room. 30 years of being twice as prepared and twice as precise and twice as unrattled as everyone else just to be taken seriously. She had never complained about it, not because it didn't hurt. Because complaining wasn't useful. And Eleanor Marsh had very little patience for things that weren't useful. She kept a newspaper clipping in the bottom drawer of her desk at Chambers, 198C7. A small article, not front page, nothing big, about a financial services company found to have misled investors. 200 workers displaced, a fine paid, nobody imprisoned. The CEO moved on to chair a larger firm. In the margin of the article, she had taped a photograph. Her father, James Marsh, work uniform, smiling. Taken at the plant's anniversary celebration 2 years before the plant closed. He looked proud in that picture. Eleanor had clipped the Archibald the same week she started law school, had carried it through every apartment, every job, every move. Not as fuel, not as a wound to keep open, as a reminder of what she was for. Tonight, she would open that drawer. But that was tonight. Right now, she had a courtroom to run. District Attorney Patricia Wynn addressed the court at 9:14 on the first morning. She was 45, sharp-featured, the kind of attorney who prepared for every possible objection before she made her opening statement, and then made it anyway with the confidence of someone who had already seen how this ends. Your Honor, ladies and gentlemen. Her voice was clear and unhurried. Richard Calloway built his reputation on one thing, trust. He invited ordinary people, teachers, nurses, firefighters, small business owners, to invest their savings with him. He told them their money was safe. He told them it was growing. He told them he was building their futures. She paused just long enough. He was lying. The room was quiet in the way rooms get quiet when something true lands in them. 380 families. $210 million. Retirement accounts. College funds. Mortgage payoffs. Everything these families had worked decades to build. Gone. Not because the market turned against them. Not because of bad luck or unavoidable risk. Because Richard Calloway chose deliberately and repeatedly to falsify records, mislead investors, and pocket the difference. She moved her gaze slowly across the room. The evidence will show that Mr. Calloway did not suspect the funds were troubled. He knew. From the very first year of operation, he knew that the investment structures he was selling to these families were fraudulent, and he kept selling them anyway. Warren Lyle rose for the defense, smooth, measured, the voice of a man who makes bad facts sound like misunderstandings. Mr. Calloway is an entrepreneur, he said. A man who built something from nothing. Yes, there were errors in judgment. Business involves risk, and risk sometimes means loss. But fraud requires intent, and intent requires proof. That proof, the brief, confident pause, does not exist! Richard Calloway did not look at Maggie or Jean while Warren spoke. He watched the reporters, still performing for the audience he had already decided on. Maggie was called to the stand on the afternoon of the second day. She straightened her blouse before she walked up, sat down, looked out at the rows of faces, thought, "Don't shake, just don't shake." "Mrs. Flores," Patricia said gently, "can you tell the court how you came to invest with Calloway Capital?" Maggie folded her hands on the railing, she told them. The seminar in 2016 at a Sacramento hotel. How professional everything looked. How confident the presenters were. Charts and graphs and language about security and stability. Richard Calloway himself at the front of the room in that charcoal suit, looking each person in the eye, saying, "I want to help you build something that lasts." She told him about the $89,000 kind of yes, 22 years of savings, the equity she'd built through decades of steady mortgage payments. She'd refinanced to access it. She'd put everything in. She told them about the quarterly statements that kept showing growth for 2 years, the small graphs going up and to the right. How she'd started to feel, for the first time in her adult life, like she might actually be okay, like retirement might actually be possible. Then she told them about March 14th, 2021. "I was making coffee," she said. "I got an email from my personal financial advisor saying she needed to speak with me urgently. I called her back, and she told me." "She told you what?" Patricia said quietly. "That the fund had been frozen by federal regulators, that there was an investigation, that the money was gone." The courtroom held its breath. "My daughter Claire was in her second year at UC Davis," Maggie continued. "I had to call her that evening and tell her I couldn't pay her tuition. I had to tell her." Her voice broke at the edge of that sentence. She steadied it. "She told me not to worry. Said she'd figure something out. She was 19 years old. She shouldn't have had to figure anything out. She should have been studying for finals." She looked up. Richard Calloway was not looking at her. He was looking somewhere to the left of her, past her, through her, like she was weather. Like she was traffic. She was just something you wait for to pass. Maggie looked at him for a moment, then she looked back at Patricia Wynne. "My daughter came home," she said. "She deferred enrollment. She got a job at a grocery store. She gives me half her paycheck every month to help with rent. That's where we are." She stepped down, walked back to her seat. Jean put his hand briefly on her arm. The specific touch of someone who wants to say, "I heard that," was true and it mattered, without saying anything at all. Gene Hartley took the stand the next morning. He sat in the witness chair with the posture of a man who had spent 35 years making fast decisions in terrible situations. Big. Steady. The kind of still that comes from practice, not from nothing. "Mr. Hartley, can you tell us about your investment with Calloway Capital?" "I put in $210,000, he said. No preamble. Just the number, clean and hard. Everything I'd saved since I was 29. Every extra shift, every overtime hour. A firefighter's pension is fine, but I wanted more than fine. I wanted to leave something for my sons. What happened to that money?" Gene's jaw tightened. "Same thing that happened to everyone else's. Gone." He looked at Richard Calloway. Richard did not look back. "I spent 35 years running into burning buildings," Gene said. His voice was steady, but there was something moving underneath it, the way a river moves hard under a calm surface. "I did that because somebody had to, because that's how this works. Some people run toward the fire, so other people don't have to. I was proud of that. I'd do it again." He stopped. "But this man's," he said. "He didn't run toward anything. He sat in a nice office and he looked at people like me, people who spent their lives doing something real, and he saw a resource. He burned my future to the ground." His voice went quieter on the last line, not louder. "And from what I can see from where I'm sitting, he hasn't lost a minute of sleep over it." Richard Calloway leaned toward Warren Lyle and said something. Warren said something back. Both of them, barely, almost imperceptibly, smiled. Maggie saw it. Half the courtroom saw it. Judge Eleanor Marsh from the bench saw it. Her pen stopped. She wrote something down. Then she continued. On the third day of testimony, Patricia Wynn introduced Prosecution Exhibit 47, an internal email, dated February 2018. From Richard Calloway's account to his senior fund managers. She read it aloud into the silence of the courtroom. Make the numbers up. Look. We need these suckers to sign on the dotted line. Don't give them time to think. Just get the signature and move on. 3 seconds of silence. Then the room exhaled, not loudly, not dramatically. The specific exhale of people who have been holding something too long, whispers, sharp intake of breath. Someone in the back made a sound that was almost a word. Patricia turned to the defendant's table. Mr. Calloway, do you recognize this email? Warren was on his feet before she finished the sentence. Objection. This has been addressed in pre-trial, overruled. Eleanor's voice was calm. A door, closings, quiet but final. The defendant will answer the question. Richard leaned forward slightly. He looked at the prosecutor and he said, in a voice that was smooth and completely devoid of any acknowledgement that a room full of human beings was watching him, "Yes, I recognize it. But let's not pretend it means what you're implying. That's business language, shorthand. You wouldn't understand the context. You wouldn't understand. 3 words, aimed at a room full of people who understood exactly what they meant, who had spent the last year understanding what those words had cost them." Maggie closed her eyes. Just for a second. Order in the court! Eleanor's gavel came down once, clean. The room settled. She turned her attention to Richard. Mr. Calloway, I advise you to watch your tone. This is not a boardroom. It is a federal courtroom. You would do well to remember the difference. Richard looked at her. For just a moment, something moved behind those flat, pale eyes. A brief calculation, assessment. Then he settled back in his chair. Of course, Your Honor, he said pleasantly. Like he was thanking someone for directions, the session continued. Eleanor Marsh sat alone in her chambers at 7 in the evening. The courthouse had mostly emptied. Cleaners moved through the halls with the quiet efficiency of people accustomed to working in the aftermath of other people's days. Outside her senso, the city was converting from the noise of productivity into the noise of everything else. She sat with a cup of tea gone cold, and she opened the bottom drawer. She took out the newspaper clipping from 1987, unfolded it with the care you give something that has become fragile from years of handling. The small article, the headline. The union man's quote, "These men gave their lives to this. Someone needs to answer for what happened to them." And the photograph tucked into the fold, her father, James Marsh, his work uniform. That smile, the particular pride of a man who knows exactly what he has built and has not yet been told it be taken from him in a single fiscal quarter. Eleanor looked at his face. She sat with it for a while, not in grief, not in anger, in the specific quiet of someone who has carried something for a long time and knows exactly why she still carries it. Then she pulled a yellow legal pad in front of her, picked up her pen. She wrote, "What does it mean when a man looks at a room full of people who trusted him and feels nothing?" she thought. Then, what does it mean when the system that is supposed to see it doesn't? She looked at the ceasing for a moment. Then she wrote, "It means someone has to stay in the room." She capped her pen, folded the newspaper clipping, put it back in the drawer, closed it. She picked up her cold tea, looked at it, set it back down. Outside, the lights of the city came on one by one slowly, and then all at once, the way they always do. Eleanor Marsh stayed at her desk. She wasn't done, not even close. Thomas Calloway drove back to his hotel that night through streets he didn't know. He wasn't from San Francisco. He'd driven down from Portland that morning. Taken 3 days off from work, he managed a hardware store, had for 15 years. Nothing glamorous. Nothing he'd ever needed to explain. He sat in the hotel parking lot for a long time before going inside. He had watched his brother all day. Watched Richard not stand when the judge entered. Watched him not look at the woman who had lost her house. Watched him lean toward his attorney during Gene Hartley's testimony and watched that smile. That was the one! That was the thing Thomas couldn't stop turning over as he sat in a parking lot in a city that didn't belong to him. That barely their smile, while a 67-year-old man talked about burning buildings. He had a USB drive in his jacket pocket. He'd had it for 4 years, kept it in the back of his socks drawer in Portland, which was possibly the least inventive hiding place in history, but it had been there, and he had thought about it nearly every week for 4 years. He'd thought about it and told himself 100 different versions of the same story. About family, about blood, about the time in 2009 when Richard had shown up at his door with a check that kept Thomas's business from closing. No speech, no conditions. Just, here, don't make it weird. He had told himself those stories. But tonight, driving back through fog, all he could hear was Gene Hartley's voice. Spent 35 years running into burning buildings, and this man burned my future to the ground. Thomas pulled the USB drive from his pocket, held it in his palm in the dark, small, cold. 4 years of the thing he should have done sitting in his hand like a question he'd been avoiding. He didn't know yet what he was going to do, but he knew this. He couldn't keep sittings in the back of that room holding on to this as if it cost him nothing. Because it was costing him something. Every night. It was costing him every single night. He closed his hand around the drive. He went inside. And upstairs in the hotel room, with the city lights showing through curtains he didn't bother to close, Thomas Calloway sat on the edge of the exhibit. And finally, after 4 years, started to figure out what he was going to do. The video had 240,000 views by 6 in the morning. By 8, it had crossed 500,000. By the time Richard Calloway's town car pulled up to the courthouse steps at 8:52, his publicist had called 7 times. His adult daughter had sent one text, no words, just a period. He looked at the period for a moment, then put the phone in his pocket, straightened his tie, walked up the steps. The video was 37 seconds long, shot from a phone in a parking structure 2 blocks from the courthouse. A reporter, mid-20s, voice slightly nervous, had asked him a simple question as he was getting into his car after the 3rd day of trial. "Mr. Calloway, is there anything you'd like to say to the detectives who've been testifying?" Mrs. Flores, Mr. Hartley. Richard had looked at her, then looked past her toward the street, then said, "I think I need a better parking spot," and got in the car. The reporter had stood there for a moment after his door closed, then pressed stop on her recorder. Then, because she was 26 years old and had been covering this trial for 3 weeks, and had sat in that courtroom and watched Gene Hartley's jaw tighten and watched Maggie Flores fold her hands and watched Richard Calloway not look at either of them, she posted it. 37 minutes later, it had 14,000 views. By midnight, 200,000. By 6 the next morning, the number was still climbing, and people who had never heard of Richard Calloway or Calloway Capital or Patricia Wynn or the 380 families were watching a man in a charcoal suit talk about parking spots and feeling something specific in their chests about it. Warren Lyle was already inside when Richard arrived, waiting in the side hallway off the main corridor, the one that didn't have cameras. He had the look of a man who had slept poorly and was working hard not to show it. The suit was perfect. The posture was perfect. The dark circles under his eyes were doing their level best to hide under careful grooming. He pulled Richard aside the moment he saw him. "The video. I saw it. 240. I said I saw it." Warren studied him for just a second. The assessment of a man who had spent 2 decades reading rooms, peaceful, and deciding in real time which battles were worth the oxygen. He let it go. "Jury sentiment," he said instead, pivoting without pause. "We need to be careful today. That comment is going to be on the mind of everyone who walks into that room this morning. We need to give them something else to focus on." Richard smoothed his lapel. "Then we give them something better. Richard, do what we came here to do." He looked at Warren steadily. "You've won 37 federal cases. Start acting like it." Warren held his gaze for a moment. Then he picked up his briefcase. "Fine," he said. "But the phone stays away all day. I mean it." Richard said nothing, which was not the same as agreeing, and Warren knew it. But there were things you could control and things you couldn't, and he had learned which was which over 20 years of standing next to men who believed the rules of rooms applied to everyone except them. He walked toward the courtroom. Richard followed. Day 4 of the trial, Warren Lyle went to work. And the thing about Warren, the thing that had kept him at the top of his field for 2 decades, that had his name on the door of a firm that occupied 2 floors of a Montgomery Street high-rise, was that he was technically brilliant, not charming, not theatrical, precise. The kind of attorney who finds the one loose thread in an otherwise solid case and pulls it quietly, methodically, until the whole thing begins to shift without anyone being able to point to the exact moment it started. He called the defense's first expert witness, an economist from Stanford with a CV that ran 4 pages. The man spent 2 hours explaining the nature of financial risk, how volatility is systemic, not personal, how even well-managed funds fail, how it looked on paper like deliberate fraud could, in a more charitable reading of these same documents, look like a series of compounding miscalculations made under genuine market pressure. Miscalculation. Warren used that word 12 times before lunch. Maggie counted. Then he cross-examined the testimony of the victims, gently, almost with sympathy in his voice, which somehow made it worse. "Mr. Hartley," he said, during his revisitation of Gene's prior statement, "before you invested with Calloway Capital, you signed a disclosure document. Is that correct?" "It is." And that document stated clearly that past performance does not guarantee future results. A pause. Yes, and it stated that all investments carry inherent risk, including the possible loss of principal. Jean's jaw moved. It said that. So you understood at the time of signing that this was an investment, not a guaranteed return? That's what the paper said. Thank you, Mr. Hartley. Nothing further. It wasn't an attack. Nothing Warren Lyle did was ever quite an attack. It was erosion. The kind that doesn't look like anything in particular until you notice the ground has changed beneath you. Maggie watched Jean walk back to his seat. He sat down heavily. Don't, she said quietly. He looked at her. He's trying to make you feel stupid for trusting someone, she said. Don't let him do that to you. Jean looked at his hands for a moment. Is it working? He said. She was honest with him because that was what he needed. A little, she said, but it's not going to matter. She didn't know yet if that was true. She was choosing to believe it. By the afternoon of day 4, Richard felt better. He could feel it, that specific sensation he remembered from the early days of his career, when a pitch was going exactly the way he'd planned it, when the room was moving in the direction he'd chosen. Warren was doing what Warren did. The expert witness had been clean. The cross-examinations had landed. The narrative was shifting. He allowed himself during the afternoon recess to check his phone. 37 missed calls. His publicist. His PR firm? An unknown number that had called 6 times, and one from Thomas. He stared at that one entry among all the others. Thomas had called at 7:14 that morning, left no voicemail. Richard stood in the hallway and thought about calling back. He put the phone in his pocket instead. He told himself it was nothing, because this alternative to nothing was something he'd been actively not thinking about for 4 years. Something small and cold that lived at the back of his mind in the space where the things you don't examine go. He had learned over 20 years of making decisions he knew were wrong, that the things in that space stayed quiet as long as you didn't look directly at them. Thomas had a copy of the recording. Richard had always known Thomas had a copy. He had told himself for 4 years that Thomas would never use it, because Thomas was his brother's, because family, because he walked back into the courtroom. He sat down. He was fine. Day 5 began the way day 4 had ended. Warren precise. The defense building its case with the patience of someone laying a floor, one careful tile at a time. But Richard noticed around mid-morning that Warren had gone quiet in a particular way. Tight. It's precise in the way someone is precise when they are managing something rather than controlling it. Richard leaned over during a brief sidebar. Is there something I need to know? Warren didn't look at him. Now is not the time. Warren. Not now, Richard. The sidebar ended. Patricia was back at the podium. Richard sat back. He looked at the back wall. Thomas wasn't there. He had been there every day this week. Standing in his spot against the back wall, arms crossed, gray sport coat, watching. Not talking to anyone, just watching. Today, the space where Thomas had been standing was empty. Something cold moved through Richard Calloway's chest. Not fear exactly. The thing that lives next door to fear. Knocking. He looked at Warren's profile. Warren was writing something on his legal pad. Neat, even lines. He didn't look up. Richard looked at the empty wall and he waited. Patricia Wynn arrived at her office at 7 on the morning of day 5 and found a package on her desk. Plain envelope, no return address, postmarked Portland, Oregon. Inside, a USB drive. And a handwritten note on a single sheet of lined paper. I should have done this sooner. I'm sorry I didn't. Everything you need is on there. No signature. Patricia stared at the envelope for a long time. Then she called her chief investigator. I need handwriting matched, she said, and I need to know what's on this drive. I need both by noon. She set the envelope down carefully on the corner of her desk, the way you set down something that might be breakable or might change everything, and she went back to work. Thomas Calloway had not gone to the courthouse that morning. He'd driven instead to a park he didn't know, in a neighborhood he'd never been to, and sat on a bench by a fountain for an hour. Watching pigeons do what pigeons do. Watching a man walk a dog. Watching 2 kids on scooters cut figure 8s around the fountain base without looking up. The way children move through space, as if it exists entirely for them. He had made his decision sometime around 3 in the morning. Not dramatically. Not with a sudden clarity or a moment of cinematic resolve. It was more like watching a tide go out. All the reasons he'd been holding on to, the family, the blood, the 2009 check, the pasta in the Fresno apartment when they were young and poor, and it was still possible to believe Richard was just a person trying to make something of himself. All of it had slowly receded, and what was left on the shore when the tide went out was Gene Hartley's voice. 35 years running into burning buildings. He hasn't lost a minute of sleep over it. Thomas thought about his own son. 23 years old, worked at a hospital, A good kid who didn't know any of this, who would find out someday. Who would ask, "Dad, what did you do when you found out?" He thought about that question. He went to the federal building. The conference room on the fourth floor was plain. Fluorescent lighting, a table, 2 chairs, a box of tissues that nobody touched. Patricia Wynn sat across from him with her investigator to her left and a recorder on the table between them. "Mr. Calloway," she said, "I want to be clear. You are here voluntarily. Everything you say is being recorded with your consent. And I want you to understand that what you provide may be used against your brother in federal court." "I know," Thomas said. "Then why?" she said. "Genuine, not a trap. Just a question." Thomas looked at the table for a moment. Then he said, "There was a man who testified a few days ago. Retired firefighter, Gene Hartley." Patricia nodded. "He said he spent 35 years running into burning buildings." Thomas stopped, and then he said Richard burned his future to the ground and hadn't lost a minute of sleep over it. He looked up. "I couldn't sleep that night. After I heard that, I have a son, he's 23. Works at a hospital. He doesn't know any of this. And I kept thinking about what he finds out someday. And what he asks me. And what I tell him." "Silence. I should have done this 4 years ago," Thomas said. "I didn't. That's on me. I can't fix that, but I can do it now." He reached into his jacket pocket, placed USB drive on the table. "The recording is from 2018, he said, an internal meeting. I was present. I was still on the board of advisors at the time. I recorded it because something felt wrong and I didn't know what to do with that feeling, so I documented it. I thought I was protecting myself. I told myself for 4 years that I was also protecting Richard." He paused. "I was wrong about the second part. Can you describe what's on the recording?" Patricia said. "Richard tells the team the flagship was structurally insolvent, explicitly, uses the word, then tells them to continue selling it. Tells them how to keep the investor reports looking clean. He looked at her steadily, 47 minutes, his voice the whole way through." Patricia did not move for a moment. Then she said, "Thomas, our meeting took place in 2018. Where was it?" "Las Vegas," he said. "Company retreat." "Nevada," she nodded slowly. "Nevada, one-party consent state." Thomas had been a participant in the meeting. He had standing to record it. The recording was clean. "I'm not a hero," Thomas said before she could speak again. "I want to be clear about that. I didn't walk out of that meeting in 2018. I didn't report it then. I went home and I told myself I'd figure out what to do, and then I didn't do anything for 4 years while these families—" He stopped. "So I'm not here because I'm brave. I'm here because I'm done being something worse." Patricia looked at him for a long time. Then she reached across the table and turned off the recorder. "We'll need a formal statement," she said, "tonight, and you'll need to make yourself available for the remainder of the trial." "Oh, and no, Thomas," she paused. "What you're doing, it's the right thing." He looked at the USB drive on the table between them. "I know that too," he said. "I just wish I'd known it sooner." That same evening at 9:07, Patricia Wynn's personal cell phone received the first of 12 text messages from an unknown number. The first said, "Careful what you push for." The second said, "These things have a way of becoming complicated." By the 10th message, the tone had changed. The 11th said simply, "Patricia." The 12th said, "Think about Sophie's scholarship." Patrick had a daughter named Sophie, 18 years old. Full academic scholarship to Northwestern, starting the fall. The scholarship that Sophie had worked for since she was 14, that Patricia had watched her earn with a specific maternal pride that had nothing to do with her own career and everything to do with what her daughter become someone. Patricia read the 12th message. She read it 3 times. Then she forwarded all 12, in sequence, to the FBI field office coordinator, her direct supervisor, and her personal attorney. She added a note. "For the record, received tonight unknown number presumed related to Calloway case." Then she put the phone face down on her desk. Her hands weren't completely steady for about 20 minutes. She noticed that. She let herself notice it. She sat with it for exactly as long as it took to become something she'd processed rather than something that was processing her. Then she picked the phone back up and went back to work, because she was Patricia Wynn, and she had been doing this for 20 years, and the people who thought a threat would stop her had clearly never done their homework. Day 6. The courtroom felt different when Maggie walked in that morning. Not louder, actually quieter than usual. The specific quiet of people who have heard something is coming and are sitting with the weight of not knowing what. The reporters in the back were arranged more tightly than usual, notebooks already open. The junior attorneys along the wall kept glancing at the prosecution table. Even the light in the room seemed to have changed overnight. Sharper, more direct, the morning fog having finally burned off to leave the city under full autumn sun. Richard Calloway arrived without the phone out, without the smile, without the confidence tour. He sat down. He looked at Warren. Warren was already seated, already arranged with his characteristic precision. But his eyes, when they met Richard, said something Richard had not seen in them before. Not strategy, not management, real caution. Richard looked at the back wall. Thomas was not there. He put his hands flat on the table. He looked forward. He waited. Patricia Wynne called her first witness of the morning at 9:08. The prosecution calls Ms. Diane Park. A woman stood from the end gallery and walked to the front. Early 40s. Neat, dark blazer. She moved with the deliberateness of someone who had made a decision recently and was still carrying the weight of it, not second-guessing, but feeling the full shape of what she'd chosen. She sat in the witness chair. "Miss Park," Patricia said, "can you tell the court your role at Callaway Capital between 2016 and 2009? Senior accounting analyst. And your responsibilities in that role?" "I reconciled internal fund reports with the documentation sent to investors. My job was to make sure the numbers matched, that what investors were being told reflected what was actually happening inside the fund end. And did they match?" Diane Park looked at the table in front of her for just a moment. Then she looked up. "No," she said, "they did not." Warren was on his feet. "Objection, Your Honor." "This witness signed." "Your Honor," Patricia said, "Miss Park did not sign the non-disclosure agreement Callaway Capital presented to former employees in 2019. The document was never properly executed on the company's side. The required countersignatures from the corporate secretary was absent. We have the original paperwork and the authenticated comparison." Eleanor looked at Warren. "Is this accurate, Mr. Lyle?" Warren's jaw was tight. "We are reviewing the validity of that claim, Your Honor." "The witness will continue," Eleanor said. "Objection overruled." Warren sat. He did not look at Richard. Richard looked at him. Then Richard looked at Diane Park. She was looking at Patricia Wynne with the expression of someone who has been waiting for a specific room for a very long time and has finally arrived in it. Diane Park testified for 2.5 hours. She had records, printed, dated, organized with the precision of someone who had known this day was possible and had prepared for it as if it were inevitable. Every year laid out: 2016, the first discrepancies between internal valuations and investor statements; 2017, the pattern becoming systematic. Not accidental. Not the kind of messy variance that comes from human error, methodical, the kind that happens when someone is making it happen on purpose. 2018, the year she brought her concerns to her supervisor. The year her supervisor forwarded her to the CFO. The year the CFO told her these reports were handled personally by Mr. Calloway and were not her area. "What did you do after that conversation?" Patricia asked. "I started keeping copies," Diane said. "Everything I had access to. I put them on an external drive and I kept it at home." "Why?" She looked at her hands briefly, then back up. "Because I had been in that building long enough to know that when someone tells you something isn't your concern, it usually means it's everyone's concern and they'd rather you not be aware of it." A sound moved through the room. Not quite a laugh. Something between recognition and pain, the specific resonance of a truth that too many people in that room had learned too late. "When you left the company in 2019, when I was let go," Diane said clearly, "when you were let go, you were presented with a non-disclosure agreement?" "I was. I refused to sign it." "Why?" "Because it included a clause preventing cooperations without any regulatory or legal investigation, and I was not willing to pretend I didn't have what I had." Patricia walked to the evidence table. She picked up a folder. "Mrs. Park, I'm showing you prosecution exhibits 73 through 80 on. Do you recognize these documents?" Diane looked at them carefully. "Yes, these are my copies. And can you confirm these documents show a systematic discrepancy between internal fund valuations and the statements provided to investors?" "Yes." She looked up at the room. "The investors were told their money was growing. Their statements showed consistent growth. The internal record showed the funds losing value from 2017 onward. The statements investors received were not based on actual fund performance." She paused, chose her word. "They were constructed," she said. Warren cross-examined her for 40 minutes. He was good. He was still technically very good. But Diane Park had been an accountant for 18 years. She lived in the precision of numbers. She had organized her record search with someone who had known this room was coming and had left nothing unaddressed. Every question Warren put to her, she answered with a date, a document reference, a specific line from a specific report. By the end, Warren was doing something Maggie had never seen him do. He was shortening his questions, because every long question gave Diane Park more space, and every answer she gave was another tile laid on the floor Warren was trying to pull up. He sat. He wrote something on his legal pad. Richard leaned to look at it. Warren covered it with his hand. That afternoon, Patricia stood at the podium and said, "Your Honor, the prosecution would like to submit new evidence received in the past 48 hours." Warren was on his feet immediately. "Objection! The defense has not had adequate time."
The defense was notified yesterday afternoon, Patricia said. A procedural requirement of Federal Rule 60.
Eleanor looked at Warren. "Mr. Lyle, were you notified?" A pause. "We were notified," Warren said. "Then your objection is noted and overruled. Continue, Miss Wynne." Patricia set up the audio equipment methodically. She explained the provenance of the recording. The 2018 meeting. Its location in Las Vegas, Nevada, the participants. She submitted Thomas Calloway's signed statement. She submitted the forensic authentication report. 2 independent analysts, both confirming the audio was unedited and unaltered. Then she pressed play. 47 minutes. The courtroom was absolutely still for 47 minutes. Richard Calloway's voice filled the room. His voice from 2018, smooth, assured, comfortable in the way that only comes from someone who believes completely that what they are doing is not going to catch up with them. And wrong. So specifically, so completely, so documentably wrong that even the people in the room who prided themselves on professional neutrality, the legal journalists, the court observers, the proceduralists, who had been carefully not reacting for 6 days, even they went still. He knew. His own voice proved it. He had sat in a conference room in Las Vegas in 2018 and said, in his own words, that the flagship fund was structurally insolvent. And then he had told 12 people how to continue presenting it to 308 families as a sound investment. "Make the reports look clean," his voice said from 2018 through a speaker into a federal courtroom in 2024. "These families trust us. Use that." 47 minutes. When it ended, the silence house lasted a long time. Then Patricia said quietly, "No further questions at this time, Your Honor." Warren did not stand for several seconds. Richard Calloway was looking at the table in front of him. His face had done something. A change moved through it the way weather moves, fast and total. The performance, the suit, the posture, the practiced flatness of those pale eyes, all still in place on the outside. But the inside was visible. For the first time in 6 days of trial, the inside was visible. His hands were on the table. Flat! Plain. Exactly as they'd been in that conference room when Warren had told him what was coming and he'd pretended not to hear it. Jean Hartley was looking at the ceiling. Maggie Flores was looking at her hands. Neither of them was crying. They were past crying. They were in the territory that comes after tears. The harder, quieter place where you simply know. Where the thing you needed confirmed has been confirmed, and the body doesn't know yet what to do with the relief of it. Richard Calloway's own voice had just told 380 families what he'd always known. He had known, from the beginning. He had always known. Warren requested an immediate recess. Eleanor granted 15 minutes. In the hallway outside the courtroom, he found Richard before Richard found him. He didn't have a soft opening. "We need to talk about plea," he said. "No." Richard, controlled, still controlled. But the confidence beneath it had changed. The chef-fit was still there, still recognizable, but it had been hollowed out. The frame of the thing without the substance inside. "We keep going." You just heard yourself say, use that, in a federal courtroom, to a jury that has been sitting in those chairs for 6 days, watching you check your phone during testimony and smile during Jean Hartley's statement. Warren's voice was very quiet, very steady. The voice of a man who delivers hard truths for a living has learned to do it without drama. "We cannot survive that recording. I have spent 16 hours looking for a way around it. I cannot find one. Thomas had standing in Nevada. The authentication is airtight. If we go to verdict, then we go to verdict." Warren looked at him for a long moment, not professionally, just as one person looking at another. "Why?" he said, not strategically, not as an attorney, just why? What are you protecting? Richard said nothing. Warren shook his head slowly. "All right," he said. He straightened his jacket. He walked to the courtroom door. He paused with his hand on it. "Richard," he said without turning around, "I've defended a lot of men I didn't particularly like. I've defended men who were clearly guilty, and I did my job without flinching. I felt fine about it." A pause. "I don't feel fine about this one." Inside, Richard stood in the hallway. At the far end of the corridor, through a tall window, he could see the street below. The coffee cart that was there every morning. A taxi. 2 women with shopping bags walking in the same direction. The ordinary afternoon of a city that had no idea what had just happened 2 floors up. And across the street, sitting on a low wall outside a coffee shop, was a man in a gray sport coat. Thomas. Their eyes met through the glass. Across the distance. 2 floors up. At that distance, expression was impossible to read with certainty. But Richard looked at his brother for a long moment, and Thomas looked back. Then Thomas looked down at the cup in his hands, and Richard turned and walked back into the courtroom. Claire Flores had driven down from Macramo that afternoon. She hadn't told her mother she was coming. She didn't want Maggie spending any part of this day worrying about her instead of herself. She'd taken a half day from the grocery store, borrowed her roommate's car, driven 2.5 hours through traffic that was exactly as bad as it always was on the 80 corridor, and arrived at the federal building at 4:15 with an envelope in her hands. 19 years old, dark hair pulled back, wearing the coat she'd bought secondhand specifically for job interviews because she'd needed something serious without costing money she didn't have. She'd written the letter 3 nights ago. At the kitchen table of the apartment she shared with her mother, the one that was smaller than her dorm room at Davis had been, while Maggie was asleep down the hall. She hadn't written it out of anger. That was the thing she needed someone to understand. She was angry. Of course she was angry. She was 19 and she'd had to leave college because a man in a charcoal suit's a resort had decided her mother's trust was a resource. But the letter wasn't about the anger. The letter was a question, because she had been watching this trial in clips on her phone every night after her shift ended, watching Patricia win, watching the witnesses, watching Judge Eleanor Marsh sit that bench with her pen and her complete, unperformative attention. And something had been building in Claire's chest that wasn't quite hope and wasn't quite certainty, but was something in that neighborhood. And she needed to know if it was real. She asked a bailiff if she could submit a letter directly to the judge. Personal correspondence from a victim's family member. The bailiff looked at her. This young woman with the second-hand coat and the envelope and the specific seriousness of someone who has no time for pretense because pretense has already cost her enough. "I'll see what I can do," the bailiff said. Claire sat on a bench in the hallway and waited. She was still waiting when Maggie came out of the courtroom at the end of the afternoon session. Maggie stopped when she saw her. Her face did the thing it does when something you didn't realize you were carrying gets put down. Claire stood up. Maggie crossed the hallway in 3 steps and put her arms around her daughter without saying anything. Claire held on. They stood there in the courthouse hallway for a moment. People moving around them. The ordinary traffic of the building at the end of a day. Then Maggie pulled back. She looked at Claire's face. "You didn't have to come," she said. "I know," Claire said, which was its own kind of answer. Eleanor Marsh received the envelope during the recess at the end of the afternoon session. The bailiff explained the situation. Young woman, victim's daughter, wanted the judge to have the letter before the verdict. Eleanor read it at her desk. It was 2 paragraphs. Handwritten, no drama, no self-pity. The first paragraph described in plain and specific language what the past 2 years had looked like. Leaving Davis's, the grocery store, the paycheck she split with her mother every month, the particular texture of a plan that had been taken from you before you got to use it. Not what it felt like in the large sense, just what it actually looked like, day to day. The second paragraph was a single question. Your Honor, I don't want him punished because I'm angry at him, though I am. I want him punished because I need to believe that when something like this happens, there are people with enough power to make sure it stops happening, that the system has people in it who care about that. Is wanting that the right reasons to want justice? Is that enough? It was signed. Claire Flores, age 19. Eleanor read it twice, set it down, looked out the window at the street below. She had been a judge for 11 years. She read hundreds of victim impacts. She had sat in rooms with grief and with anger and with every combination of human feeling that comes when someone has been seriously wronged and is finally being asked to say so in a room that will listen. But this was different. This was a 19-year-old girl asking, with total seriousness and not a drop of performance, whether justice was believing in. Eleanor picked up her pen. She wrote 2 sentences on a note card. She sealed it in a plain envelope. She called the bailiff. "Give this to the young woman who sent the letter," she said, "before she leaves the building." The bailiff found Claire on the bench in the hallway where she'd been sitting all afternoon. Claire opened the envelope. She read the 2 sentences. Her eyes went still. Then she folded the note card and put it carefully into the inside pocket of her coat. She pressed her hand flat against it for a moment, feeling the slight stiffness of the card through the fabric. She stood up. She walked to the courtroom door and slipped into the back repo, and in her coat pocket, a note card said, "Yes, wanting others to be safe is always the right reason." E.M. Eleanor Marsh received the phone call at 7:48 that evening. She was at her desk. Takeout container she'd barely touched on the corner, the city outside converting from the noise of work into the noise of everything else. She looked at the screen. Judge Raymond Patterson, Chief Judge of the Ninth Circuit, a man she had known for 16 years, who had written a letter supporting her appointment to the federal bench, whom she had until recently considered a person of genuine integrity, she answered. Eleanor, he said. Warm, practiced. The warmth of a man who had learned early in his career that warmth was a tool. How are you holding up with the Calloway matter? It's a lot of attention for one case. I'm managing. Good, good. A pause that was slightly too long. You know, a lot of people are watching this one. The business community, the Judiciary Oversight Committee, people will feel strong for finance sector to cases touch things. Eleanor waited. My point is simply that measured is good in a case like this. A verdict that's proportionate. That doesn't create more turbulence than the situation requires. Another pause. Sometimes the most powerful thing a judge can do is know when enough is enough. Eleanor was quiet for a moment. Raymond, she said, are you asking me to compromise a verdict? The silence that followed was 4 seconds long, she counted. I'm asking you to be practical, he said finally, to think about the long game. Are you asking me to compromise a verdict? She said again. Identical tone, identical words. Not louder, not harder, exactly the same, which was somehow more definitive than either. A longer silence. Think about it, Patterson said. 3 degrees cooler than when the call began. That's all I'm saying. She heard the click. She sat the phone in her hand. Then she sat down and she opened the bottom drawer. She took out the newspaper clipping from 1987. She unfolded it the way she always did, with the care you give something that has become fragile from years of being needed. The small article, the headline, the union man's quote, and the photograph tucked into the fold, her father, James Marsh, in his work uniform, at the plant's anniversary party 2 years before the plant closed. She looked at him. She turned the clipping over. On the back, in her own handwriting from 1989, the first week of law school, when she was 22 years old, and the world felt both enormous and very particular. When you have the power, don't forget why you wanted it. She read it. She looked at her father's face on the other side, then she put the clipping back. Folded, replaced in the drawer, closed. She pulled a fresh legal pad in front of her. She picked up her pen and she began to write the verdict. Not the final version. There was still testimony to complete, still closing arguments to hear, and she was not a judge who decided before she had finished listening. She had never been that, but she was writing, because she knew with the clarity she had spent 30 years developing which way this went, and Raymond Patterson's own fall had not changed that. If anything, it had made it more certain, because the call told her something important. The people who wanted Richard Calloway to walk away with a manageable outcome were afraid of what she was going to do, which meant they understood what she was going to do, which meant they understood why. She wrote for 2 hours. Outside, the city settled into its nighttime self. The lights came on in the buildings as across the street, office by office, the way lights do when people are staying late because the work requires it. Eleanor Marsh was one of those people. She stayed late because the work required it. She stayed late because 380 families had shown up every day in that courtroom and trusted the room to do what it was supposed to do. She was not going to let them be wrong about that. Not on her bench. Not today. Not ever. The morning came in gray, not the dramatic gray of storms. The quiet gray is a city that doesn't yet know what today means. Fog off the bay in slow, soft sheets. The coffee cart on the corner with its usual line of people who needed something warm before whatever came next. Maggie Flussace was in that line at 6:47 in the morning. She had woken at 4 again, lay in the dark for an hour, gave up at 5. Stood in front of her closet for a long time before reaching for the white blouse. The good one. The one from Claire's high school graduation. She ironed it twice, same as the first day of trial, because the first time still didn't feel careful enough. She ordered a medium coffee, black, paid with exact change, stood on the courthouse steps and drank it while the fog moved around her. 14 times in 3 weeks, she had walked into this building. She knew which door opened without sticking. She knew the bailiff who always nodded at her. She knew the bench in the 3rd row with the loose screw. She knew the sound of Eleanor Marsh's gavel, clean, definitive, a period placed at the end of something that needed ending. She knew this building, but today felt different. Today was the last day she would walk in here as a woman waiting for something. She finished her coffee, dropped the cup, straightened her blouse, walked up the steps. Gene Hartley arrived at 7:15, navy blue jacket from his retirement ceremony, same as T1. He found Maggie already inside. He sat beside her. Neither said good morning. The silence between them had become its own language over 3 weeks, specific and sufficient. Claire arrived at 8:10, coat already on, the note card from Eleanor Marsh still in the inside pocket where she'd put it 2 days ago. She sat between Maggie and Jean. She'd driven down from Sacramento again, left at 5:30. She hadn't told her mother until she was already in the parking structure. Magsa had said, "You didn't have to." Claire had said, "I know," which settled it. The courtroom filled faster than any previous morning. People had traveled from Phoenix, Denver, Portland. People who had invested with Callaway Capital and lost things they would spend years rebuilding. The air had a quality past tension, the feeling of a very long breath being held, knowing that today it would finally be released. Outside, the woman with the handmade sign was back. Justice for Callaway's victims in red marker. Someone had added below it in different handwriting, "We see you, Judge Marsh." Maggie didn't look at the signs. She looked at the bench, empty still, waiting. Richard Callaway arrived at 8:31. No town car today. He had driven himself. He'd woken at 5, looked at the ceiling for an hour, and decided that he was going to drive himself to the last day of his trial. He wasn't sure why, maybe because it was the last thing he could control. He looked different walking in. The charcoal suit still good, the hair still right. But something in how he carried it had shifted. The way a building shifts when the foundation moves slightly. All the walls still standing, but something underneath no longer exactly level. Warren's Lyle was waiting as the side hallway. "Last chance," Warren said. "Quiet. Just the two of them. Right now, before she comes out. I can approach Wynn? No, Richard. We go to verdict." Warren looked at him for a long moment. "Then God help us both," he said, which was not something Warren Lyle said. In 20 years of federal practice, Richard walked to the defendant's table, sat down, put his hands flat on the table, looked at the back wall. Thomas was there. Gray sport coat, arms at his sides now, not crossed the way they'd been all week. Present. Fully present. Their eyes met. Richard held it for 2 seconds, then looked forward. "All rise for the Honorable Judge Eleanor Marsh." The entire room watched this time. Because they'd been watching for 3 weeks, they knew what came next. Richard Callaway stood up, clean, without prompting. Without his lawyer leaning over, he stood when everyone else stood, held it until Eleanor took her seat and sat back down. 3 weeks too late, but there. A murmur moved through the room, brief, barely audible. Eleanor didn't react. She was already arranging her documents, already exactly what she had 30 years becoming. "Before we proceed to closing arguments, I understand the defense has filed a final motion." Warren stood. "The defense moves to exclude the audio recording submitted on day 6 on grounds that the chain of custody was insufficiently documented." Eleanor had read the motion at 5:15 that morning. Motion denied. The chain of custody is documented by Mr. Thomas Callaway's signed statement, witnessed physical transfer, and forensic authentication by 2 independent analysts. The recording was made in Nevada, where one-party consent applies by a participant in the meeting. Admissibility stands. 1 sentence, then the next, then the last. Warren sat. Richard did not move. Patricia Wynn stood before the jury and spoke without notes. 380 families, she began. In a case involving $210 million, it's easy to get lost in a number too large to feel. So let's make it smaller. She paused. Margaret Flores, 58 years old, 31 years of work, $89,000 in savings, lost in a single morning. Her daughter left college. Claire works a grocery store shift and gives her mother half her paycheck every month. She let that sit. Jean Hartley, 67 years old, 35 years as a firefighter, $210,000. Gone. He lives in his brother's spare room. Another pause. Richard Callaway knew. You heard his voice. You heard him say, "These families trust us. Use that. That is not miscalculations. That is a man who looked at 380 families and used them deliberately, repeatedly, for years." She sat. Warren made his closing with the same precision that had characterized his entire defense. He argued miscalculation, complexity. He did his job completely, and the room could feel it wasn't going to be enough. Eleanor dismissed the jury at 11:22 in the morning. "We are in recess until the jury returns. Court is adjourned." The gavel. One clean sound. The room exhaled. Maggie and Jean and Claire sat on a bench in the hallway. Maggie had brought sandwiches. Nobody was particularly hungry, but they ate anyway because eating was something to do with your hands. They talked about small things. Jean's thinking about moving back to California. The tomatoes Maggie had been growing in the community garden. Whether the Thai place 2 blocks away was still open. Tomatoes. She was talking about tomatoes while 12 people down the hall decided whether the last 4 years of her life had meant anything. Jean looked at Claire and said, "You look like you're..." Claire said, "She keeps telling me that like it's supposed to be a warning." Maggie said, "It is." And for a moment, brief, human, real, all three of them almost smiled. Richard sat alone in a witness prep room on the second floor. Small, fluorescent, a window that looked directly at a brick wall, which was the most honest view in the building. He was thinking about the recording, not strategically, just about what he actually sounded like. Hearing yourself played back in a federal courtroom was a specific thing he had not been prepared for. These families trust us. Use that. He had said that. He remembered the afternoon light in the Las Vegas conference room, the coffee getting cold, 12 people looking at him, and he had looked at 380 families, their savings, their futures, the weight of their trust, and called it a resource. He sat with that, undressed, unframed, for the first time. He thought about 1994, the apartment in Fresno. Richard had spent his last $140 on a CCC exam textbook, cereal for 3 nights. Then Thomas had shown up with groceries and started making pasta. Richard had said, "What'd you do, rob a bank?" Thomas had laughed. "No, I got paid today. Don't make it weird." They'd eaten pasta, watched basketball. Richard sat in the small room. His jaw was tight in a way that had nothing to do with Warren Lyle or Patricia Wynne. He sat for a few more minutes in the quiet, with just the brick wall and the plain, undressed truth of what he had done. The jury came back at 3:18 in the afternoon, 4 hours and 12 minutes. When the bailiff's voice came through the intercom, the hallway did something specific. People who had been sitting stood up without deciding to. A reporter knocked over a paper cup and didn't stop to pick it up. Maggie stood. Her hands were not shaking. She thought, okay, one more thing, just one more thing. Claire took her arm. Jean was already at the door. They went in. The courtroom had the electricity of a room that knows it is about to become a before and after. Richard walked in, sat down. Warren beside him, straight, still, the posture of a man who has done everything he can and is now in the part that belongs to other people. Eleanor entered. Everyone stood, including Richard, clean. Without hesitation, she looked at the foreperson. A woman in her mid-50s, reading glasses on a chain. Has the jury reached a verdict? We have, Your Honor. The clerk took the paper. Eleanor read it. Her face did not change. She passed it back. The defendant will rise. The foreperson held the paper and read, on the count of wire fraud. Guilty. Someone's in the gallery made a sound. Small. A breath released. On the count of security fraud. Guilty. On the count of conspiracy to commit fraud. Guilty. On the count of obstruction of justice. Guilty. On the count of making false statements to federal regulators. Guilty. 5 counts. 5. Clean as rain. Maggie closed her eyes just 1 second, then opened them. Jean sat beside her like a wall, his hands flat on his thighs. Claire's hand was on her arm. Patricia submitted the victim impact statements, all 380. She read 3 in full, Magsy's, Jean's, and one from Dorothy Mills, 81 years old, retired schoolteacher from Phoenix, who had submitted hers in writing because she couldn't make the trip. Eleanor had read all 380 that morning, arriving at 5 to finish the last 40. Warren made his case for leniency. He cited precedent letters from Richard's past. His daughter had written something careful and honest about loving someone you no longer recognize. Eleanor listened to all of it. When Warren finished, she looked at Richard. "Mr. Calloway, is there anything you would like to say before I impose sentence?" A long moment. "No, Your Honor," Richard said. The room shifted. People had expected something. One last performance. Just, "No." Eleanor looked at her papers. 3 seconds of stillness. Then she spoke. "Mr. Calloway, you have been found guilty on all 5 counts. The evidence is not merely sufficient, it is overwhelming. Your own recorded words leave no reasonable interpretation other than deliberate, sustained, calculated fraud against people who trusted you with everything they had." She looked at him directly. "Your behavior in this courtroom, the phone, the comments, the visible disengagement during victim testimony, none of that factors into what comes next. A judge who punishes how a defendant behaves rather than what a defendant did is not doing her job. I am doing my job." A pause. "What factors into this sentence is what you did, who you did it to, for how long. You were not a desperate man. You had intelligence, opportunity, and the specific trust of people who believed you were using both on their behalf. You made a series of deliberate choices, not once, but repeatedly over years, to use that trust as a tool." She looked briefly at the gallery, at Maggie, at Jean, at Claire. Then back. "The people in this room came here because they still believe this system works. Not perfectly, not always, but enough. They came because they needed to believe that what happened to them would be seen, that the weight of what they lost would be measured honestly. It is my responsibility, our collective responsibility, to make sure they are right. The room was so quiet you could hear the ventilation, the faint rustle of a coat. Nothing else. I sentence you, Richard Calloway, to 28 years in federal prison without the possibility of parole. I am ordering the immediate liquidation of all assets for victim restitution, beginning with full financial assessment of each of the 380 affected families. 3 seconds of silence. Then the room released. Not applause. A collective exhale. People grabbed each other's hands.
Someone behind Maggie said, "Oh, thank God," in a voice that cracked.
Maggie sat perfectly still, pressed both hands flat against her thighs. This is outrageous. Richard's voice, not controlled anymore, standing on his own. 28 years? Do you understand who I am? What I've built, Mr. Calloway. Eleanor's voice did not rise, did not harden. It simply stopped him, the way a wall stops you. Sit down, I will appeal this. Every day, every year. Mr. Calloway, same tones, same temperature. Warren's hand was on his arm as Richard didn't move. You have no idea, he started. I have every idea, Eleanor said. 3 words. Quiet as anything. And somehow those 3 words, in that voice, at that volume, were more authoritative than anything said in this room in 3 weeks. Richard stopped. He looked at her. She looked back. Steady, clear, completely unintimidated by his money, his name, his fury, or the 30 years he had spent in rooms where those things ended conversations. You have every right to appeal, she said. The law guarantees that right, and I respect it. The appeals process will treat you with exactly the fairness the law requires. The same fairness, no more, no less, owed to every person you defrauded. The law does not calculate sentences based on net worth. It never. Today it is simply saying so out loud. She looked at the bailiffs, Espicourt the defendant. Warren sat, hands folded, eyes forward. A man who had done everything his profession allowed and lost anyway. The cuffs clicked into place, and then he turned, not toward the cameras, not toward Warren, not toward the reporters. He turned toward the back wall. Thomas, still there, gray sport coat, arms at his sides. The stillness of someone who has already let something go and is standing in the quiet of having done in it. The room was doing nothing else around them. People were moving, reporters writing. Someone crying the tears that come when relief and grief arrive at the same sum, and the body doesn't know which one to lead with. But between the two of them, silence. Richard's jaw worked. His eyes, those flat, practiced, unreadable eyes, were doing something they hadn't done once in 3 weeks. Something that had nothing to do with strategy or performance. He nodded. Once, slow, not an apology. He hadn't earned that yet, but something, an acknowledgement. The smallest possible admission a person can make without words. I see it. I see what I did. I see what it cost you. I know. Thomas looked back for a long moment. Then he looked down. His shoulders moved. Once, a single breath passing through him. The bailiff's slouch walked Richard through the side door. The door closed, and Richard Calloway was gone from the room. The courtroom did not erupt into applause. What happened was quieter and more real. People reached for each other's hands. A few cried the tears that come when you've been holding something together for a very long time and are finally given permission to stop. Maggie sat for a full minute. She reached into her purse, found the white envelope, held the photograph of the house with the yellow door. She put it back without opening it. The not needing to look was its own kind of answer. Outside, the afternoon had cleared. San Francisco, sharp and bright, the fog gone. Patricia found Maggie and Jean near the base of the steps. The restitution process will take time, she said. Honest. It won't restore everything, but it will be something real. Thank you, Maggie said, for not stopping. Thank you for showing up, Patricia said. Every day, both of you. It matters more than people understand. She moved back toward the building. She had 12 text messages to hand to the FBI, a report to file, and a daughter named Sophie who would be starting Northwestern in the fall on a scholarship that was, as of this afternoon, no longer any kind of threat. A reporter reached Maggie before she made it to the car. Mrs. Flores, how do you feel? Maggie thought about it, actually. Something that was broken is not fixed, she said. The house isn't coming back. The years Claire lost aren't coming back. But today, someone looked at what happened and said out loud that it wasn't supposed to, that it mattered. She paused. That's not everything. But today, that's enough. She walked to the car. Jean called his son from the driver's seat. It's done, Jean said. And 28 years. You okay, Dad? Jean looked through the windshield at the courthouse steps. Yeah, she said. I actually think I am. Thomas stood on the low wall across the street until the crowd thinned. He wasn't waiting for anyone. He thought about the pasta in 1994, about 2009 and the check that arrived without conditions, about 4 years of a USB drive in a sock drawer. He was not going to pretend this was clean. He had sat on that recording while Jean Hartley lay awake somewhere. while Maggie tried to figure out what to tell her daughter, while Dorothy Mills in Phoenix didn't know if anyone was ever going to do anything. Late, imperfect, not heroic, but done. He walked to his car. He drove north. Eleanor Marsh was still in her chambers. At 6 in the evening. She sat with a cup of tea that was, for once, still warm. She thought about Patterson's call. She would address it through proper channels. She had the notes, the call log, 11 years of institutional knowledge about how to handle exactly this. Not tonight. She thought about Richard saying no when she asked if he had anything to say. She hadn't expected that. Maybe nothing. Maybe something small beginning. That wasn't her department. She opened the bottom drawer. She took out the 1987 newspaper clipping, unfolded it. The small article. The Union man's quote. The photograph of her father in his work uniform, smiling with the pride of a man who doesn't yet know what's coming. She turned it over. Her own handwriting. 1989, first week of law school. When you have the power, don't forget why you wanted it. She looked at his face on the other side. I thought about Claire's letter. Is wanting that the right reason? She thought about the 2 sentences she had written back. Yes, wanting others to be safe is always the right reason. She had meant it then. She still meant it now. She folded the clipping, put it back, closed the drawer. She wrote one more thing on her legal pad. For no filing, for no record, just for herself, the work continues. She put on her coat, turned off the light, went home. 6 months later, the restitution process moved forward the way these things do, slowly, imperfectly, but forward. Gene received the first check in February, a third of what he'd lost. Enough to start something modest. His younger son bought a house in April. Gene went to the closing, stood in the empty living room and thought about 35 years of showing up. The story had not gone the way he'd drawn it. It was his story. He was still in it. Maggie enrolled in a community college program, office administration with a nonprofit focus. She wanted to work for a victim advocacy organization. Patricia Wynne had given her 2 names. The tomatoes came in well that spring. She brought some to Gene when she drove down in March, left them on his brother's doorstep with a note. From my garden. Don't make it weird. He texted back, too late. Already weird. Thank you. Claire submitted her application to UC Davis for the fall. She wrote her personal statement about 2 years spent outside the system she was trying to get back into, about what she'd learned, about what she'd watched her mother do. She did not write it as a tragedy. She wrote it as a beginning. In the inside pocket of her second-hand coat, folded and laminated now, was a note card with 2 sentences in a judge's handwriting. She didn't take it out often. She didn't need to. She knew what it said. Thomas testified in 2 additional federal fraud cases that year. He hadn't asked for immunity. He was given the opportunity to do what he should have done 4 years earlier, and he did it each time without drama and without expecting to be called brave. He called Richard once, 6 months in. You doing okay? Thomas said. Counseling 3 times a week. What kind of questions? About what I was afraid of. Why I thought I need He stopped. It's a lot of questions. Sounds about right. Thomas. Yeah, I'm sorry. A pause. I know, Thomas said. Not forgiving yet. Not refusing to. Just telling the truth about where he was. I know. The call ended the way those calls always end. By the clock, not by the conversation. In a federal correctional facility in Northern California, Richard Calloway sat from Dr. Marcus Webb 3 times a week, a calm, unhurried man who had worked in correctional facilities for 22 years, who had learned that the most useful thing he could offer most people was a room where the performance wasn't required. Richard had needed several weeks to figure out how to be in a room without performing. He was getting better at it. Tell me again about the 2018 meeting, Dr. Webb said one afternoon. I knew the fund was insolvent. I told them to continue. I told them the families trusted us. Use that. And when you said it, what were you feeling? Richard was quiet. Competent, he said. That's honest. I felt like I was solving a problem, like I was the smartest person in the room, like I always had to be, because if I stopped being necessary, he paused. I didn't know what happened then. I'd never let it get that far, so I kept solving bigger problems. To stay necessary. Silence. I didn't think of them as families, Richard said. I thought of them as a resource I'd already secured. I didn't think of them as people. And now, a long quiet. Gene Hartley ran into burned buildings for 35 years, Richard said finally. I've been thinking about what that takes. To run toward what everyone else is running from, over and over, for strangers. He looked at his hands. I never did anything for other people. You helped Thomas in 2009. It's because he was mine. Because it was easy. He shook his head. That's not the same thing. No, Dr. Webb said. It's not. The room held its quiet. I can't fix it, Richard said. The money doesn't fix the years. It doesn't put Claire back in school. It doesn't give Gene back the plan he spent 35 years building. I can't undo it.
No.
So what do I do? Dr. Webb looked at him steadily. You figure out who you are without the performance, he said. You take the questions seriously. You find out what you were actually afraid of. And how do you deal with that? Finally, for the first time, Richard looked at the window, a rectangle of sky, blue. The ordinary, uncomplicated blue of a Tuesday afternoon that didn't know or care what was happening in the room below it. That sounds like it takes a long time, he said. Yes, Dr. Webb said. It does. There's a pause. Okay, Richard said, just that. Okay, not transformation, not resolution. Just a person in a room with no audience and no performance required, saying okay to the long, necessary work of becoming someone who understood what he had done. It was a beginning, the smallest possible kind, but real. In a federal courthouse in San Francisco, a bottom drawer in a judge's desk held a newspaper clipping from 1987, folded carefully with a handwritten note on the back and a photograph tucked in the fold. The drawer was closed, the office was empty, the work was done. For today, justice isn't the end of a story, it's the moment a new one can begin.